has overcome the lies, the good news of His Majesty in His Christ. And it is vital that we raise our tribal flag, the flag of the conquering lion of the tribe of Yehuda.
Millions of Christians throughout the world, Your Imperial Majesty, will regard you as the reincarnation of Jesus Christ.
Shabbat Shalom, Senbet Salam, greetings. I am Rasiadonis Tafari, Wyndham Yarden of the Line of Jewish Society of the Imperial Majesty. Now this has been and still remains a very active, extremely active news period, as well as a prophetic period, very active prophetic period, with all that's going on in particularly Egypt, and with the repercussions and the resonance, scriptural, spiritual, prophetic resonance, as above, so below, because there are many signs and portents, as the scripture says, as the Messiah, Yehoshua HaMoshiach Jesus Christos, as he prophesied to us, which we have in the Gospels, of these particular signs of the time. And we'd like to get into them a little more detail concerning these prophetic signs, but we don't want to lose track of our order and our discipline, namely that this is Shabbat, Sabbath, a Senbet time. Now, from what we're being made to understand, with the vis-a-vis the relative Egypt unrest and turmoil in Egypt and crisis in Egypt in the various different ways, the battle for Egypt, and there's so many different ways that out in the media and in the internet and the public discussion that this Egypt situation has been articulated or described as being, well, we're still in Exodus, the book of Exodus, our sabbatical studies for the Sabbath, our Sabbath studies, and we are here at the 19th. We began in the book of Exodus, the Ethiopic Exodus, after fulfilling the Ethiopic Genesis. We began that a couple of weeks ago. We're now in the 7th. Today, the so-called day of departure. That's what the protesters in Egypt called it, the day of departure. But for us in our Hebrew sabbatical studies, this is actually the 19th Sabbath, and is known as Sitot Bamarinyo Mebba, but in the Hebrew it's known as Teruma or Teruma. And here in this our IOTA program, once again we advise ones who would like to study along with us and who have some familiarity with Amarinya, or at least would like to begin to understand the Amharic, that this particular program, the IOTA program, is highly advised. And here we're at, let's just begin the first part of this right here, because like we said, there's so much. This is a very active prophetic and news period that we're in, but we have to maintain some discipline. And as Rastafari, as Ethiopian Hebrews, we really need to have a better discipline. In fact, we might begin like a Rastafari report where we can deal with some of the news related issues and updates about that, while also maintaining a discipline with our sabbatical studies and with the Nababate and Amharic education, so forth, and so on. But let's just begin right here from the 19th. Let's bring this up right here. The Sabbath house readings, and this is the 19th sabbatical. This is the 19th Sabbath that we are currently in, which is known as Teruma in the Hebrew, but to us as Ethiopic Hebrews, in the Ethiopic Sitota and Mebba, and it begins in the Orit, or the Torah, Exodus chapter 25 verse 1 to Exodus chapter 27 verse 19. And if we'll begin with a couple of verses, Besem Ab, وولد ومنفس القدوس أحد أملاك እግዚአብሔር ሙሴና እንዲህ ሲል ተናገረው. And the Lord, እግዚአብሔር Yahweh, spake to Moses, saying, ስጦታ ያመጡልኝ ዘንድ ለእስራኤል ልጆች ተናገር። በገዛ እጁ ሊሰጠኝ በልቡ ከሚያምረው ሰው ሁሉ መባ ተቀበሉ. Speak to the children of Israel, ለእስራኤል ልጆች, that they may bring me an offering of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart. Ye shall take my offering, to everyone that gives with a willing heart. And then it continues in verse 3, Ka'ana rusuma yemitakabbaluta mebba yihno. And this is the offering which ye shall take of them. This is the offering: gold, silver, brass, and it gives an enumeration of the various offerings that were to be given, free will offerings. And we get to verse 8 is something very interesting, where it says Bemekakalachoima adirzen mekdesa yisaruling, and let them make me a mekdes, let them make me a holy place, that I may dwell among them. So here we get the construction of the tabernacle and the donations from the Dekika Israel, the Bani Israel, for the construction of the tabernacle, of the Mekdes. Now, in these particular studies, our Sabbath studies, this is Moses in the mount. This is the tabernacle. This is the materials, the offerings of the materials for the tabernacle. The tabernacle, the ark of the covenant is mentioned in this particular chapter, chapter 25. The tabernacle, the table of showbread, of the showbread, is mentioned in this particular chapter, chapter 25. The tabernacle, the golden candlestick, is mentioned in this particular chapter, speaking of the tabernacle. And this particular sabbatical reading, as we have mentioned, and you can consult free downloadable the Sabbath house reading chart. When the 19th, this is the 19th Sabbath. You understand? And there's a resonance, with what's going on in mundane worldly Egypt, since this right here is the Ethiopic Exodus, and this was the coming out. This is a memorial and a study of the coming out of our ancestors out of that Egypt, and to see a reflection of what's happening currently in this modern Egypt. But the Torah, the basic foundations from Exodus chapter 25 verse 1 to Exodus chapter 27 verse 19. Exodus chapter 27 verse 19. This is the ground that we will seek to cover. But in chapter 25, this is usually called, this is usually called teruma within the Hebrew, and bamarinya in the Amharic. Well, for this particular verse, we have mebba, we have sitot, gift, and we have mebba, a certain type of offering. And we need to understand, well, exactly what type of offering this is. Now, in the the second verse is where we actually find it mentioned in Orit Ze'at Mi'raf Haya Amesa Guter Hulet Sitot Ayamet Ulinzen Le Israel Lijoj Tenager Begezai Juali Set Ein Belubua Kamiyamro So Hulu Mebatek Ebalu. Speak to the children of Israel that they bring me an offering. That's the key word, the offering of every man that giveth it willingly. of every man that giveth how willingly with his heart, ye shall take my offering. That every man that giveth it willingly. So there's no duress. This is not like taxes, as people would say. It's not in that Monday. This is the offerings. The offerings for the construction of the tabernacle. So there's a general authority for these types, the types of Exodus which is found. There's a general authority for these types. The Schofield study has a footnote down here where one, it says, as to the persons and the events. So there's a authority, a sitota, actually a sultan, sultan. There's an authority for the types of the Sa'ad or the Exodus as to the persons and the events in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 1 to 11. Secondly, as to the tabernacle, and we have Hebrews chapter 9 verses 1 to 24. So we need to make a note of this, the general authority or sultan, the general authority for the types of Exodus which are found. Now, it's kind of interesting, and we've dwelled on this week speaking on mundane or the worldly modern Egypt and what's going on out there, and scripture and prophecy, so forth and so on, in a very cursory a general way. So we would like to spend time right now, since this is the eve of the Shabbat of the Sabbath. This is so-called in mundane Egypt, they call this the day of departure. This is Friday, February 4th, 2011. But it doesn't really seem like much. Mubarak hasn't really gone nowhere, and so forth and so on. That's all. But because they want him to leave, to get out, the coming out was an Exodus. This is the point we've been trying to make. But what people have overlooked is what we learn in this 19th sabbatical study, that there's a general authority. There's a general authority for the types of the Exodus. The authority is to the persons and to the events, as well as to the holy place, the tabernacle. Now, why is this important? Well, let's learn. Having the assurance that the tabernacle, the Mekdes, that in the Mekdes, everything is typical. Everything is according to a certain type. So to understand this is what we have to understand, these types. This is what we go to the ancient Egyptian, not the modern. These are not the real people anyway. You can tell when you look at the more authentic monuments and everything like that. But when we look at the true Kamite, the true Hamitic or Kamitic, the true black African in the African foundation according to types, and then we see how these types have been permutated and mutated even to these modern types and figures. People say, oh, it's just a figure of speech. Basically what they are speaking is a hieroglyph. They're speaking a type. You understand? In other words, they're using simple types to say deep things without going into all of the details. So we have to understand that in the Mekdes, everything is typical. That means everything is according to type. The details must of necessity be received as such. So we must also Mekabel Kabbalah the details. There are certain details that need to be received. You understand? As such, in other words, as being according to type, being according to typology, being according to what one would say the mythos, the mishtir, but the different meanings of the type. Otherwise, these things will be misunderstood, and we'll have much of the chaos and confusion and the counterfeiting of true faith. And this is a bunch of counterfeits. We live in a time of counterfeits. Anyway, 2 warnings are necessary. There are 2 warnings that we have to give in this 19th. And number 19 is significant as well. But this 19th sabbatical study. One is that nothing may be dogmatically asserted to be a type without explicit hadith Kidan, or New Covenant, New Testament Sultan. So without specific New Testament authority, nothing may be dogmatically, dogmatically asserted to be a type without explicit New Testament authority. We're going to go on and explain as we go through this why that's important. Secondly, all types not so authenticated. So we have to authenticate When we talk about hermeneutics, when we talk about metargom, when we talk about interpretation, you understand there is a process. It's like when they say trust but verify. This is the verification process. All types not so authenticated must be recognized as having the authority of analogy. So when someone says, well, by analogy, I'm saying this, or spiritual congruity, it's congruous, or it might be incongruous merely. Now, the typical meanings of the materials of the Mekades, of the holy place, the materials of the tabernacle, and the colors. So the materials, we're going to study the materials and the colors of the tabernacle. By many are believed or accepted or trusted to be as follows. One, when we speak about work or gold, deity, the melekot or divinity in manifestation, the divine glory. So therefore the work or the gold is for the deity or the melekot, the divinity in manifestation, and it bespeaks of the divine glory. Then we have silver, the bur. Silver speaks of redemption. Silver speaks of redemption. Now, Schofield Study has some notes here that we would advise. We would advise the diligent disciples and the students, those interested, of course, to make note of this and to study it in one's own time. Exodus chapter 30, verses 12 to 16. Exodus chapter 38, verse 27, and Schofield has a note that hopefully we'll get to touch on in this particular sabbatical reading and feeding. Now, brass, the brass is a symbol of judgment. The brass now speaks of the symbol of judgment. Now, in the King James Bible, verse 3, and in HAILE SELASSIE, the first version, or the Revised Amharic Bible, verse 4, it basically says, we'll have to connect this. Let's move from verse 3 in the King James. Says, and this is the offering which ye shall take of them, gold and silver and brass. Nasim Samayawina Hamrawiya Kayema Gimja Terua Befetam, verse 4, where it begins work bur nasim, and it says, it goes on to say, and blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen and goat's hair. So we're focusing on the first three parts where it says, and this is the offering which ye shall take of them, gold and silver and brass, work bur nasim. So the work is the deity, the melekot in manifestation, speaks of the divine work, the divine glory. Silver bur is the redemption, and brass nas, symbol of judgment. The brass now, this is very brazen, right? You hear that expression as a figure of speech. Very brazen. He was brazen. He's so brazen. It's a symbol of judgment. Brass, symbol of judgment. And also the police, they say the brass, is the police, and the police establishments, which are all established according to the basic types so set here in the Hebrew and the Ethiopic Bible. And then it comes from the Kamite, or the ancient Egypt, the ancient native Kamite, black, the native, the indigenous Egyptian origins, biblically, scripturally, and if you will, historically. So if we understand this, we'll understand that. Now, brass is a symbol of judgment in the brazen altar, and in the serpent. Remember the serpent of brass? That's in Numbers chapter 21, verses 6 to 9. Then we have blue. Blue, Bamarinya, is Samayawi. Samayawi in heaven, Bamarinya is Samai, or the Shemai, in Hebrew the Shemayim. Now we have that root Samayawi, which is blue. Blue is heavenly in nature or origin. Blue, in other words, lapis lazuli, true blue, the two truths, the two tilat, or the two tablets of the law of God, written by, or the 10 words written by the finger of God. So Samayawi means blue, according to the Amharic, from Samai, which refers to the heavenly in nature or origin. Purple purple, Hamrawi, purple bespeaks of royalty, So these colors, the colors are very symbolic. So we're learning symbolic logic or symbolic logos. You understand? Right here in the Old Testament, in the Ethiopic Exodus, right here. Samayawina Hamrawiya Kayima Gimja. What about scarlet? Scarlet or red, K, bespeaks of sacrifice. The A here bespeaks of sacrifice. So what have we learned here? Well, first of all, we're learning that the offering says, speak to the children of Israel that they bring me an offering, bring me a teruma, bring me an offering. Did we touch on that word? Let's go into the, was it verse 2 right here. Speak to the children of Israel that they bring me an offering. It's the Strong's 8641. We go to 8641. We have truma or teruma or truma. Deuteronomy 12 and 11 is a good note. Teruma from the 73:11. It's a present, something offered up, something presented. Especially in sacrifice, or as a tribute. It's a gift. It's called biblically a heave, the heave offering, which has to do with the shoulder of the animal. We'll touch on that. But the heave offering is also called a heave offering later on. Oblation is something offered, or it's an offering. Now, what's one thing interesting here? We speak of oblation, right? Oblation, and then you also know that there is what they call it, though this is not found in our Hebrew, but in other spiritualities, a libation, which is something poured. But here's an oblation. You understand? Let's learn the difference. Put a note for that. It's very interesting when you see the difference between oblation and a libation. Right there, the study that we went through, but not to get off of track right here. Verse 2 says, Sitota yamet ulins and le isara le jochitanagar, so that they offer to me a gift or a teruma, a sitota. You understand? Speak to the children of Israel. Let Israel le jochitanagar. In other words, they're not going to be able to know to do this unless you, Musa and Aaron, speak to them. You understand? Begeza iju, in one's own hand, Leah said, to give me, in other words, that which they own, that which they truly possess. You can't give to Yahweh with something like steal something from somebody else, take what somebody else and give it. That wasn't in your own possession. Begezaiju Lee said, and Belibu, here's the key, ka mi yamro, Belibu ka mi yamro, so hulu meba tekabalu. It says, of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart, ye shall take my offering. Now it's very interesting what it says Bamarinya, but because of time, you know what I'm saying, because of a time, we'll leave that for the more detailed study. This is a basic overview right now, plus each of your brothers. You understand? The brotherhood, the Rastafari brotherhood, the Rastafari Ethiopian brotherhood have to take personal responsibility and do your own studies. Get beyond this. Just don't accept, well, what we're teaching here is all that you need to know, and you don't need to look at it. That will be idiotic. That'll be foolish. That'll be ridiculous. You understand? We have to get out of Babylon so come out such ridiculous behavior. We have to take personal responsibility and study this. Some people may say, well, why do I have to know this? Why don't you pray on that? Why don't you seek the answer? If we tell you the truth, you'll say, no, that's not it. But then we ask you what the truth is, and you say you don't know. So you're going to have to find the truth for yourself, basically. So we who accept the teachings of His Imperial Majesty, you understand, and accept the testimony of His Christ, are engaged in such studies here. Now, this all is concerning this 19th Sabbath, or it's spoken of as being the offering of the teruma. it is speaking of the tabernacle. And we must remember that Moses was in the mount. Moses was in the mount. Now, this is important, very important, the Mekdes here, as we cover just this one chapter of 40 verses. This one chapter of 40 verses must be and could be a whole study in itself. Just one portion of this particular sabbatical study, which covers about roughly 2 to 2.5 or so chapters. But it's the details, as it says in this note right here, having the assurance that in the Mekdes everything is typical. The details must of necessity be received as such. So in the Mekdes, or the tabernacle, speaking comprehensively is explained in the Hadith Kidan, the New Covenant, New Testament, as typical in three particular ways. And you, brothers, you need to get this in 3 ways. What 3 ways is a tabernacle speaking comprehensively explained in the New Testament as typical? 1, of the church, of the Beta Christian, of the church as what? As a habitation of God, as a habitation of JAH, as a habitation of Elohim, through what? Through the Spirit, through the Menfes, through the Ruach. Exodus chapter 25 and 8, Ephesians chapter 2, 19 to 22. Secondly, the second of the 3 ways that the tabernacle speaking comprehensive is explained in the New Testament as typical in, what is the second of the 3 ways? Of the mitmanan, of the amanya, of the, for lack of a better word in English, the believer, or the admitter, as we say, of the admitter. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 16. Thirdly, it is typical as a figure of things in the Samai, or the Shemayim, as typical of things in the heavens, in the heavenly. Hebrews chapter 9 verses 23 and 24. Now in detail, all speaks of Christos, all speaks of the Mashiach, all speaks of the Messiah in the detail of the Mekdes, which is to speak and to say of the tabernacle. 1, the Ark, the Tabot, in its materials. What are the materials of the Tabot? Acacia wood, or something, the gopher wood. See Exodus 26 and 15 and the Scofield, the reference note. And gold, acacia wood, and the work and the gold is a type of the humanity. The acacia wood, you understand, you can't even see what race was Jesus. What you see, the wood is what? Brown. You understand, the wood is reddish brown. You understand, it bespeaks of his humanity as an Ethiopian, as a black man, plain and simple. This is according to the teaching, speaking of the ark, right? This is the ark, and the materials of the ark. What was the ark made of? Acacia wood, right? And gold. So they say this is the type of what? The humanity, speaking of the acacia wood. And of the deity, speaking of the gold, because we learn that the typical meanings of the materials and the colors of the tabernacle, you understand, are namely gold symbolizes the deity or the divinity, the melekot, you understand, in manifestation, or the melekotawi kabur, the glory. Now, when we speak of the wood is speaking of Christos's, of Jesus Christos's, his humanity. His humanity. And if we need to make the racial, and we must make the racial connection, because the Bible says according to the seed means Zer, and Zer means race. Plain and simple, easy, very easy to understand, except to those who hold a racial point of view that is not vouchsafe, or would like to take race out of the equation. If you do want to take race out of the equation, you must also take the Zer, or the seed, out of the equation. And if you're faithful to the scripture and to interpretation thereof, you know the seed is very important. You understand? According to the seed is all throughout the scripture. And seed basically means, plain and simple, race. It is not so what they call it, PC, people being politically correct, you know, so they don't want to say race, or they'll say seed is the seed of, from the seed of David, and the seed of such, you know, the seed of Abraham, and the seed of God's people. You know, they'll say it in that religious sense, but when you break down that the seed is a particular race, you know, because I'm from the seed of my father, you know what I mean, earthly speaking, you know what I mean, from that seed. You're from the seed of yours. Now, in the ancient times, this is what developed into the various different races that we have today. But let's move on from that point, because that point has already been proven right and exact. Now, in its contents, speaking of the tabernacle, a type of Christos as follows. In the contents, that means that what is contained therein, speaking of the tabot, the ark of the covenant, and the tabernacle. So we have the tabernacle, and then in the innermost of the tabernacle is the tabot, is the ark of the covenant, and in its contents is a type of Christos as a having God's law in his heart. As the tabernacle, we have the tabernacle, then in the innermost of the inner we have the ark of the covenant, the holy of holies, and the ark of the covenant, and then in the ark of the covenant we have the two tilot, or the two tablets, the two truths within. So in this sense, we see that since this is speaking of Christ, in Christ's contents, you understand, he has God's law in his heart, in the innermost portion. Exodus 25 and 16. B, the wilderness food. And when they was in the wilderness, the Midreb Beda, there was a wilderness food, or a portion of his people. He is that wilderness food, that manna, or portion of his people, according to Exodus 16 and 33. C, himself is the resurrection, the Tinsai. You understand? He's the resurrection, of which Aaron, or Harun's rod, his better, you understand, is a symbol. So the rod of Aaron is a symbol of the resurrection of the Mashiach, the resurrection of Christ. Exodus 17 and 10. Now, thirdly, in its use, the tabot, the ark, especially the mercy seat, what's known as the mercy seat, was a type of God's throne. This is a very significant point right here, that the mercy seat, you understand, the mercy seat was and is a type of God's throne. Now, people will say, yes, you know, in different religious traditions, they will read that, they will admit that, but they really don't take to heart exactly the significance, what that means, when we combine that with the fact that the throne of David was Jehovah's throne as well. And so we have this bringing of God's throne down to earth. So when we say that HAILE SELASSIE, you understand, is Christ in his kingly character, it shouldn't really surprise the truthful people. You understand, the ones that seek the truth and are willing to accept the truth as the truth is true. But there are many people who even coming across the truth would like to twist the truth into something that is more fear seeming to their perspective. You understand? But we have to accept the truth as it is. We have to adjust ourselves to the truth and not adjust the truth to ourselves. Now, in its use, the ark, especially the mercy seat, it's a type of God's throne. That is, it was to the sinning, the Hatiyatenya, you understand, the sinning Israelite, the sinning Hebrew, the sinning one amongst JAH's people. It was a throne of grace, and not of judgment. See, so this is one of the key areas that the ark, especially the mercy seat, it was a type of God's throne. A type of God's throne for the sinner, as a throne of grace, and not of judgment. As not of judgment, this was due to the fact that the mercy seat, which was formed of gold and sprinkled with the blood of atonement, which vindicated the law. You understand? In other words, it's vindicated. It ratified the law. You understand? In other words, when one had sinned, which was worthy of death, it was their blood. So now the sprinkling, the offering of blood, it vindicated the fact that the law was true and just, as well as gave a cover for the sinner. It was like a probation for the sinner, where they get the ideas even that they get in their legal system today, the basic principles. So the throne of grace, as a throne of grace and not of judgment, being vindicating the law, and the divine holiness, the divine Melkotawi Kadisana, was guarded by the Kirubim or the Kaprim. You understand? The Kirubim in Genesis, we have Genesis 3 and 24. We have Ezekiel 1 and 5, an important reference note there. And now, connected with this idea, it's important to understand propitiation. What does propitiation mean? To be able to define for yourselves and for your mind what these terminologies mean in their basic, simple root meaning. These things are not beyond us. Romans 3 and 25, there's a note there as well, and there's a Schofield reference, a Schofield study. Now, what we'd like to do, we probably might touch on, want to give the bread, the showbread, its own. Well, showbread is also mentioned in this particular chapter right here. But in order to understand, well, why this particular order, scripturally speaking, this next note I think explains it rather well. I'm trying to take out that pretty this, pretty that. It's pretty well, pretty much. Why we say pretty? Doesn't pretty define something else? Anyway, that's a point to self and others who are like I and I like them. Now, all begins with the ark. This is important to understand, that everything all begins with the Tabot. All begins with the ark, which